Amidst the torrential rains and the echoes of gunfire from the fierce battles, strange, inexplicable things happened on the battlefield, leaving even the strongest warriors bewildered. In moments of resolution, as the war brought men to the brink of pain, shadows of unknown origin appeared, lurking in the sky, leaving those who witnessed them puzzled, as if there were some force, watching, waiting, and possibly entering this deadly game. These are stories that many American soldiers carried with them throughout their lives, but to this day remain only vague, doubtful memories. Reports of unidentified flying objects, strange lights in the sky, inexplicable attacks, all were dismissed as mere anecdotes or forgotten in the shadow of war. Yet there are those who cannot forget, cannot resolve, and they know that there is something beyond human understanding that can prevent this devastating war. These are stories not only about war, but also about supernatural phenomena that we still cannot explain. And in the fierce war in Vietnam, where the darkness is not only covered by the enemy, but also by the untouchable, the questions still have no answers. When the movie Predator was released in 1987, audiences were captivated by the unseen extraterrestrial hunter stalking and killing a highly trained team of US Special Forces. Little did they know that during the Vietnam War, both sides' militaries had been attacked by something just as terrifying and bizarre, an unknown enemy in real life. Wherever humanity has engaged in large-scale warfare, combatants have found themselves caught up in strange incidents that defy conventional and rational explanation. In the aftermath, these unresolved occurrences are usually attributed to enemy action. It is only when hostilities have ended and both sides claim they were not responsible that it becomes apparent that another mysterious participant might have intervened in the conflict. From the unsolved disappearance of Caesar's 9th Legion during the invasion of Britannia, to the alleged abduction of the Royal Norfolk Regiment during the Dardanelles campaign, and the encounters of British and US bomber crews with mysterious Foo Fighters over Nazi Germany, few major conflicts have passed without producing accounts of inexplicable, supernatural, or otherworldly events. In most cases, where individuals have come forward to describe such experiences, their testimonies are easily dismissed due to the lack of physical evidence or third-party witnesses. However, it is much harder to discredit similar stories that arise during times of war, as reports often come supported by written documentation or the corroborating testimony of other soldiers involved. When the Vietnam War finally came to an end in 1975, it had raged for nearly 20 years, claiming the lives of nearly 60,000 US military personnel and forever changing the lives of countless others. It devolved into a political quagmire that deeply divided American society. The vehement public outcry against the conflict suppressed many of the unexplained incidents that had occurred during that period, keeping them buried until years later. In the summer of 1968, US commanders noted a significant increase in reports of Vietnamese air activity around the area of the demilitarized zone. Incidents were logged by both Army and Air Force units, claiming they were engaged by substantial deployments of enemy aircraft, which appeared to be observing their movements and actively disrupting their patrols by flying toward them at high speeds. As a result of these reports, US Air Force patrols were intensified, and orders were issued that photographs of the new enemy planes should be taken whenever possible for intelligence and evaluation purposes. Several frantic aerial engagements followed, but the American pilots involved claimed it was impossible to capture images of the Vietnamese aircraft due to their superior speed and maneuverability. Things came to a head in June when the Australian ship HMAS Hobart was attacked near Tiger Island. The guided missile destroyer had been tracking a number of unknown aerial targets when it came under attack. As other US destroyers and planes raced to its aid, Hobart was rocked by a series of catastrophic explosions that killed 2 sailors and wounded 8 more. The official report later designated it as a friendly fire incident, claiming that American warplanes were responsible. However, witnesses at the scene gave conflicting testimony. Some claimed the mysterious aerial targets the ship had been tracking were the ones that caused the damage, while others stated that the missiles fired by the Americans had failed to lock on to the enemy aircraft and had mistakenly struck the ship instead. This would not be the last such encounter. Shortly after the attack on the Hobart, patrol boat PCF-12, commanded by Lieutenant Pete Snyder, was traveling along the Tachyon River, about 10 kilometers south of the DMZ. The crew's radio operator overheard a garbled transmission from another patrol boat, PCF-19. PCF-12's sister vessel, positioned further up the tributary, was reporting it was under attack by unidentifiable lights in the sky. Snyder immediately ordered his men to action stations, and the small craft surged upriver toward PCF-19's designated patrol zone. As they powered through the muddy waters, the radio transmissions from the other boat became increasingly frantic and incoherent. It sounded like they had engaged 2 enemy aircraft and were now under heavy fire, which was affecting their ability to maneuver. Minutes later, the horizon was illuminated by an eerie red glow. When Snyder and his crew finally caught sight of PCF-19, they found the boat ablaze, lazily spinning in a wide circle, with her rudder apparently jammed to starboard. Her main armament was silent, but small arms fire was still sporadically directed at 2 unidentifiable objects, which were repeatedly flying over the beleaguered vessel. As PCF-12 fought its way toward the stricken boat, Snyder scanned the 2 attackers for any recognizable features. Both were moving at an incredible speed, and through binoculars he could make out little other than large glowing balls of what appeared to be solid light. As the objects passed over PCF-19 once again, the American boat suddenly exploded in a violent hail of debris. The bright lights immediately disengaged and sped off up the river toward the DMZ, disappearing from sight within seconds. The crew of PCF-12 was able to fish out badly burned sailors from the water before Snyder quickly ordered the boat to turn back toward the safety of a nearby Quaviet Marine Corps base. The survivors managed to explain that they had first noticed the 2 objects shadowing them from a distance, apparently mirroring their patrol movements. As the lights drew closer, the captain of PCF-19 had ordered a warning shot from the boat's main .50 caliber armament. The objects immediately split up and began to buzz the boat at high speeds. There was no sound of gunfire or rockets being launched, but explosive detonations peppered the vessel and the waters around it. The helmsman had tried to bring PCF-19 around when a further explosion struck her stern, locking her in a fatal turn, which Snyder and his crew had witnessed upon arriving. A shout of alarm from the rear of PCF-12 snapped Snyder back to the present. The 2 objects were now back in view, following the ship downriver at breakneck speed. The young lieutenant ordered full speed ahead, pushing the boat to its maximum of 30 knots. He fired off a short, urgent radio request for assistance from any nearby units as the lights closed to within 300 yards of the speeding patrol boat. Snyder's crew opened fire, but unable to bring their main gun to bear, they hammered away with the rear-mounted .50 caliber and the 2 side-mounted machine guns. It was difficult to aim effectively as the boat pitched and lurched through the choppy waters. but Snyder was sure he could hear rounds impacting the surface of the two pursuing orbs of light. Suddenly, a torrent of freezing water soaked him and his men as angry detonations erupted in the river around them. The sailors could neither see nor hear anything being fired by the pursuing craft, but the explosions impacting all around them were terrifyingly real. Just as Snyder resigned himself to the likelihood that he and his crew would share the same fate as those aboard PCF-19, there was an ear-splitting roar overhead. A pair of F-4 Phantoms screamed past in pursuit. As the Phantoms overshot and began to turn back, the two pursuing lights broke away and shot off upriver, disappearing into the night. This allowed the patrol boat to continue its course towards safety. It had largely been assumed that these mysterious new weapons were being supplied to the Vietnamese forces by foreign backers. But later that summer, an incident occurred that directly contradicted this theory. A reconnaissance unit of Army Rangers was camped out in an area of the DMZ called North Country, tasked with observing a Viet Cong position to the north of the American lines. One morning, around 0200 hours, the team's spotters became aware of a brilliant blue light in the sky approaching from the west. The light hurtled toward the area where the Ranger team was hidden before pulling up about a quarter of a mile away, hovering motionless overhead. A foreboding silence descended on the valley, prompting the U.S. servicemen to instinctively reach for their weapons. Almost simultaneously, tracer rounds erupted from the Vietnamese positions, followed by a wave of heavy machine gun fire. The Rangers stared in astonishment as the hovering ball of light remained completely still. Then suddenly, it took off, hurtling through the night sky toward the enemy encampment. All the American soldiers could do was watch in horror as brilliant white beams of light shot from the hovering craft, strobing back and forth across the Vietnamese forces. Wherever the beams touched the ground, they left explosions or raging fires behind, and the night was punctuated by the screams of wounded and dying men. This continued for several minutes, until all the guns fell silent. The object then hurtled back westward toward the direction it had originally come from, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of the Viet Cong position. The following morning, a reconnaissance platoon cautiously ventured into the wrecked Vietnamese camp. All around them, the devastation was staggering. Charred and twisted bodies, melted weapons, and supplies reduced to ash. The officer in charge of the unit collected whatever useful items could be found for evaluation and took several photographs of the destruction before quickly ordering a retreat back to their own lines. The descriptions of the strange objects and their incredible maneuvering capabilities provided by the witnesses in both of these incidents were virtually identical to those given by a number of other units deployed in the region at the same time. While frightening, these accounts were nothing compared to an incident that would occur 2 years later, further into the conflict. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bomber, one of the largest military aircraft ever constructed, remains in active service today, despite first flying back in the 1950s. With a wingspan of 56 meters and capable of carrying an explosive payload of 70,000 pounds, each individual B-52 could level a small town or village in mere seconds. The B-52 was the primary offensive weapon of U.S. forces during the Vietnam War, flying over 125,000 separate bombing missions across Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Due to their high operational ceiling and reliable weapon systems, only 17 of them were lost during the entire conflict. In the summer of 1970, Captain William English was in charge of a 12-man detachment of Green Berets stationed in Saigon. His unit was one of the Army's designated Alpha teams, special forces units tasked with carrying out covert operations against high-value Viet Cong targets. In June of that year, English and his men were ordered to locate a B-52 that had reportedly been lost over Laos. The bomber's pilots had reported visual contact with an unknown aircraft that did not register on their radar screens. They described the target as odd-looking, covered in bright lights, before their radio transmissions abruptly ceased. The Alpha team was tasked with locating the missing aircraft, retrieving any sensitive materials on board, and rendering the plane inoperable to the enemy. After receiving their orders, they were deployed by helicopter 160 miles from the Laoshan border and began conducting aerial reconnaissance around the B-52's last known position. It didn't take long to locate the downed aircraft, which was found about a mile across the border. However, the dense canopy around the wreck prevented a helicopter insertion. The team, therefore, readied their equipment and set off on foot through the jungle toward their objective. Within minutes of arriving at the crash site, the soldiers were unnerved by what they saw. The B-52 was virtually intact, sitting upright on the jungle floor, surrounded by unbroken trees and foliage. The only obvious sign of damage was to the undercarriage, as though the plane had impacted the ground without deploying its landing gear. The Green Berets took precautions to ensure they were not walking into an enemy ambush, then fanned out to establish a defensive perimeter before advancing for a closer inspection. To their shock, they found that all of the external doors and hatches were still fully secured. The team had to use explosives to blast open an entry point. When they ventured into the B-52's dark and foreboding interior, they were unprepared for the horrors they would find. The lifeless bodies of the flight crew were still strapped into their seats. All 6 corpses were horribly disfigured, their skin shredded and bones broken, yet English noted there was nowhere near the expected amount of blood loss for such violent injuries. The plane's payload remained secured and ready for deployment in the bomb bays, with the crew's flight equipment and instruments arranged in a neat and orderly fashion, as if the aircraft had just been in flight. English and his men were typically unshaken by the horrors of war, yet they would later describe what they found inside the B-52 as eerie and truly disturbing. The sight of the disfigured crew members and the strange, almost untouched condition of the aircraft left a sense of unease that lingered long after their mission. The men quickly resolved to complete their task and return to friendly territory as swiftly as possible. English divided his team into 2 groups. One would venture down to the bomb bay and rig it for detonation with satchel charges, while the other gathered papers, code books, and dog tags from the dead crew. As they worked, English documented the scene, taking photographs for intelligence analysis. Once their task was complete, the team hurried back toward Vietnamese territory, their sense of urgency heightened by the looming threat of enemy forces. They were visibly relieved when, in the distance, they heard the dull crump of their explosives detonating, signaling the destruction of the aircraft's payload. When they arrived back in Saigon, English's report to his superiors pulled no punches. He detailed everything that made little sense about the mission, from the condition of the wrecked B-52 to the odd circumstances surrounding the crew's deaths. Despite the professionalism of his report, English would later reflect that after his submission, he was treated like a pariah by his senior officers. He was removed from command and reassigned to a desk job at an Air Force base in the United Kingdom. Months after his reassignment, English received word that his entire team had been wiped out in an enemy attack. This devastating news only added to his growing disillusionment with the military. 3 years later, he was discharged from the service and returned to the United States. Angry and frustrated by the way he had been treated, he sent copies of the photographs he had taken inside the bomber to several prominent ufologists, including Dr. J. Allen Hynek. The experts were immediately struck by the eerie similarities between the downed B-52 and a strange case in Russia from 1961. In that incident, a Soviet AN-2P cargo plane had vanished from radar screens, only to be found later, perfectly intact, in the middle of a dense Siberian forest. No trace of the 4 crew members was ever found. English's efforts to communicate with ufologists, however, seemed to have drawn unwanted attention. He claimed that after reaching out to these experts, there were several attempts on his life. One night, 2 men on motorbikes reportedly visited his home and riddled the house with machine gun fire. Narrowly escaping death, he eventually moved to rural Virginia, changed his name, and took a quiet job at a local TV station. The violent threats and strange events had pushed him into obscurity. But the memories of his experiences, along with the unanswered questions surrounding the B-52 wreck, haunted him for the rest of his life. The US government has never publicly commented on reports of UFO activity during any of the conflicts it has been involved in, including the Vietnam War. It has consistently maintained that such accounts described by servicemen and women are in some cases fabrications and in others exaggerations or misunderstandings of more mundane phenomena. In reviewing the available evidence for some of the reported incidents, it is clear that in certain instances, the government's stance may be correct. In times of war, soldiers are subjected to unimaginable levels of stress and anxiety, which can push their minds far beyond normal thresholds of thought and understanding. Traumatic events occur that are so difficult for soldiers to process that their minds often create additional memories to help fill the gaps in the fragmented information they have. This psychological coping mechanism can help rationalize what has taken place, but it also leaves room for misinterpretation or embellishment. Our understanding of mental illnesses, such as PTSD and Gulf War syndrome, is still evolving, and it is entirely reasonable to assume that some of the aerial encounters witnessed by infantrymen in the summer of 1968 were indeed the result of perfectly conventional military aircraft. That said, it is also reasonable to argue that the US government cannot simply dismiss the testimony of so many soldiers, spread across so many locations, reporting such incidents. These are men and women who have received some of the highest levels of training available, and whose judgment had been unquestioned by their superiors until the point they reported these strange events. When the war in Vietnam eventually ended, it was clear that the Viet Cong did not possess any advanced technology or wonder weapons. Their victory had been achieved through sheer weight of numbers and guerrilla warfare tactics as old as war itself. Moreover, the characteristics of the aircraft described by witnesses, such as anti-radar capabilities, point to technology that was still in its infancy during the Vietnam War and is considered a comparatively recent achievement in military technology. Soldiers like Army Rangers and Green Berets are well versed in countless ways to incapacitate or kill an enemy. When these highly trained individuals report that they cannot explain how a particular death occurred or how they were attacked, it gives those accounts added weight. Taking all of this into account, it seems plausible that, in the fog of war, some of the soldiers and pilots reporting alleged UFO encounters might have made simple mistakes. However, the sheer number of credible testimonies cannot be ignored. There is compelling evidence suggesting that someone or something in the Vietnamese theater of war possessed technology far beyond what was publicly acknowledged at the time. Whether these objects are of terrestrial or otherworldly origin remains up for debate. As we will explore in future episodes, the history of warfare has often been intertwined with reports of supernatural and otherworldly activity, including during ongoing military operations in the Middle East. Our closing thoughts go out to the brave men and women who put their lives on the line every single day to keep our society safe and secure. And even though time has passed, these strange stories continue to haunt those who witnessed them, leaving in their minds big questions that will never be answered. Are these phenomena just the product of stress, psychological disorders during war, or is there really a force beyond our understanding that intervened in the fate of the soldiers? We cannot know for sure, but one thing is clear. These stories continue to live on, forever mysterious, and will forever be a part of history that we cannot easily ignore. Thank you for taking the time to follow today's mysterious story. Hopefully these discoveries will make you think and expand your perspective on things that cannot be explained. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next discovery videos. See you again in other interesting stories where the mysteries will continue to be revealed. Have a great day and stay tuned for more.